In this video, I want to talk about the state and statism. If you've ever argued with libertarians online, you would know that they like to call people statist as an insult. Now, let's talk about what this means. The state is a political association that has a monopoly on violence. Statism is the belief in or support of the state, and a statist is a person who supports the state and believes in statism. But first I want to say that the point of this video is not to discuss what we should call the state of affairs that would result after the abolition of the state. Whether we call that liberty, socialism, anarchy, communism, anarcho-communism, whatever you want to call it. I'm here to discuss what is the state and what is the opposite of the state. What is anti-statism? What is the definition of the state? Sociologist Max Weber defined the state as the only human political association which is capable of wielding a credible monopoly on the legitimate use of force or violence within a given territory. We're going to break that down in a minute. The state is a political association, and it's the only association which is capable of wielding a monopoly. So if there's more than two states, that's not possible. If there's more than one government, you don't have a state. Neither of them is a state if there's two of them. So it would have to have a monopoly to be considered a state. There would have to be a territorially defined sovereign government for it to be described as a state, because it has to be a monopoly, and that monopoly is over territory, and it's also a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. And what I'm talking about with force and violence is initiation of force. So the government is the only one, the monopoly, they're the only one with the right to commit legalized acts of violence, basically, legitimized acts of violence. The government's job is to legitimize the use of violence when it is used by itself, the government, and to not allow anyone else to use violence, whether to rob people or to attempt to solve conflicts, which violence doesn't solve conflicts. Violence is a form of conflict. And government's role is to stop us from being able to do this and committing acts of violence and crime. The problem is that government legitimizes the use of violence when it is committed by itself, the government, and they claim to do this in order to maintain public order, and it doesn't work. Legitimate use of force or violence within a given territory. Now, that should show you the government's role is to legitimize the use of force when it's exercised by the government, because they have a monopoly on it. No one else is allowed to use force, so the government's use of force is considered legitimate. Credible use of force means that people believe that the government is going to come. People believe the police are going to come and that the army is going to continue defending the country. If you have a problem and the government's the only one who can help you and they decide not to, then you can't really do anything about it, at least not legally. You have to resort to other means. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about getting rid of government or self-government, especially not that. I'm just talking about what would government look like in the absence of the state. Well, you'd start off by undermining credibility. That's the first component of the state, which has something to do with delegitimizing it. Those are related. If you can get people to understand that the government is not going to protect them when they call, and then it's not there to protect them, and it's only there to prevent them from defending themselves legally unless they asked or paid for permission, then you can undermine the credibility of the government and delegitimize it, because it will no longer be able to claim rightfully that it is capable of wielding this monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So if the credibility of the government is undermined, then it can no longer claim to be capable of wielding this monopoly on the use of force within a given territory. Therefore, it will have no legitimacy. And the way you do something about the monopoly on the use of force within a given territory is you let people defend themselves. See, if government has too strong a monopoly on the use of force, then people have to ask and pay for government permission and licenses to be able to defend themselves and use quote-unquote force. And because government's a monopoly on force within a given territory, you also have to demonopolize. You can do that by decentralizing and shrinking the federal government so that the states and people have more power proportionally, and so that government doesn't have power to confer monopoly status on businesses with licenses and permits and favorable professional regulations. And we can't trust a government that is a monopoly to regulate business monopolies, because they're both monopolies. They will do things in each other's interests. Government can't be trusted to regulate business if it is a monopoly, if it is a state. There's a lot of ways to undermine monopoly. The most important is to undermine the monopoly on force, because people should be able to defend themselves, and people will argue whether the use of defensive force is actually force, because it's not violence. I mean, it is conflict, but it's not the initiation of aggression. That's what we want to avoid here. The state has a right to initiate aggression, and we don't. It's good that we don't, but it's not good that the state has a right to initiate aggression. And ending the use of force, that would involve getting rid of force as a solution to law enforcement. And the use of force by government to solve conflicts, we do that by peacefully administering the law. We wouldn't be enforcing anymore at all. We would be administering the law peacefully, and we would be making sure that people abide by their contracts. And if someone breaks a law, unless they're a seriously violent criminal, then they would have a lot of options over how they would repay their debt to society and or their victims, because the essence of having a lot of choices is that you don't have a monopoly. You don't just go to prison. You can maybe get into the military or pay the person. So there'd be more choices in a state-free economy. And we have to end territorialism. And the state monopoly over land, like the 50 states, they each have a monopoly over land. That is a form of territorialism as well as statism and monopoly. And then the way you end territorialism is to end the 50 states' monopoly over land. And you learn about something called panarchy, which is the idea of a non-territorial government. You can have anyone protect you from anywhere. If you'd like to learn more about anti-statism and non-territorial government, please look up panarchy, functional overlapping in competing jurisdictions, and national personal autonomy, developed by Austrian Marxist Otto Bauer.